not be afraid. Open wide the doors for Christ.
Pope John Paul II's journey on earth has ended, but the changes he brought to the Church and to the world will live on.
I think he's one of the greatest popes of all time.
He has had an effect on our time as few individuals have.
There is power in the papacy, but John Paul's power came in large measure from his own will, his own personal strength. He may well have been the single most effective freedom fighter of his generation. How will he be remembered?
I would say they'll call him the public pope.
The most apt phrase may be John Paul the Communicator.
I like John Paul the Great myself. Being a church historian, I know that's not used very often. He'd be only the fourth pope about whom it would be used. And whenever you use the term great, you mean that he was pontiff at a time of transition, a transition that would almost be of earthquake proportions. And this pope would certainly have been so.
Karol Joseph Wojtyła was born on May 18, 1920, in the town of Wadowice in southern Poland. His father was an army officer. His mother, a frail woman who did occasional work as a seamstress. His older brother would go on to become a doctor. Like many young Poles, Karol became an altar boy. He also worked as errand boy for a local theatrical company. The experience began a lifelong love of the theater. At the age of 9, he tasted tragedy for the first time with the death of his mother. By the time he was 15, he was in school plays, taking leading roles and even directing. He excelled academically as well.
When he graduated from high school, he was the valedictorian of the class, and the Archbishop was so impressed with his speech and his record, his accomplishment in school, he invited him to have lunch with him to become a priest. He didn't want to. He wanted to be an actor.
He studied Polish literature in college, and as all young men were required to do, he attended military camp. An avid athlete, he also played chess and guitar and wrote poems and plays. When he was 19, the world took a terrible, violent turn. In September 1939, Germany opened its attack on Poland and soon had the country under brutal control. World War II had begun. Young Karol would always remember the terror of seeing friends, neighbors, and teachers snatched from their homes, never to return. In 1941, his father died. For a while, Karol found comfort acting in a clandestine theater group. Then he found his true calling. He joined an underground seminary to study for the priesthood. He also worked in a quarry to meet Nazi labor requirements. In 1945, Soviet troops ran the Germans out of Poland, but the Soviets had their own brand of tyranny to visit upon the Poles. Karol Wojtyła became a priest the following year. His life in the church would forever be colored by the oppressive rule in his native land.
He came out of a situation, he was trained and formed in a situation where dissent is a luxury, where there should be no cracks in the lines, no cracks in our common defense, because it was basically us against them. When you're in a situation like that, which is more life and death, then dissent, or even democracy, if you will, is a luxury, and he couldn't stand for that there, and he obviously relayed this when he did become Pope. So some of the determination of that definitely came from those post-war experiences in Poland, when it was really, really a completely different world.
At age 38, he became an auxiliary bishop, one of the world's youngest. At 43, he was elevated to Archbishop of Krakow. And at 47, Pope Paul VI named him a cardinal, a prince of the church, eligible to vote for the next pope. Cardinal Wojtyła became known as a respected man of the church with a concern for the common man. Among those who were impressed by meeting the cardinal was Ray Flynn, who would later become mayor of Boston and then U.S. ambassador to the Vatican.
I knew him long before he was Pope. Not that I could say that I realized I knew he was going to be Pope, but I knew he was a very special man.
"1978 was the year of 3 popes. Pope Paul VI died in August after a 15-year pontificate. He was succeeded by an Italian cardinal who took the name John Paul after his 2 predecessors, but he died just 33 days later. Karol Wojtyła and his fellow cardinals convened once again to choose a successor. A puff of white smoke meant the decision had been made.
Habemus Papam. We've got a pope. That much we can understand. And suddenly we hear this name, which nobody can pronounce, and most people still can't pronounce outside of Poland. Karol Wojtyła? What is a Karol Wojtyła? We couldn't find him anywhere. Finally, we realized that the first non-Italian pope in 4.5 centuries had been elected, and he was from all places, Poland. We couldn't guess then what a profound effect on his own country and on the world this new pope would have.
I was a young assistant in the Archdiocese of St. Louis, and I heard it, and I can remember there was almost like a sense of dare, a sense of excitement, a spark, a new interest, a new hope, that it almost seemed from the beginning that what the church, what the College of Cardinals was saying is, we're not going to do business as usual. There's going to be something different. There's going to be something bold. There's going to be something daring about this new pope.
The changes began from the day of his installation. Correspondent Jerry Bowen told CBS viewers what he saw.
More than 250,000 people gathered in St. Peter's Square to witness the start of the ministry of John Paul II, a celebration marked by its international flavor and at times informality. There were thousands of pilgrims from Poland, some dressed in native costume, and banners in the square held by Lebanese seeking peace for their homeland. Most of Europe's royalty was present, as were diplomats and politicians of the West and the East, including Henryk Jablonski, the president of Communist Poland. Like his predecessor, John Paul ruled out a crown and received instead the pallium, a wool stole covered with crosses. 112 cardinals of the church walked to the papal throne to give the 58-year-old pontiff the kiss of obedience. But when the Polish primate, Cardinal Stefan Wyszynski, approached, John Paul rose to embrace him and finally kissed his hand, a sign of respect for the senior prelate. In a strong, at times forceful voice that echoed across the massive square, the pontiff, in his homily, made a plea for religious freedom, asking governments to open their boundaries, economic and political systems to Christ, so that he can serve mankind. Most of his address was in Italian, but in a symbolic gesture to Catholics in the Soviet bloc, he spoke in Russian, Czech, Ukrainian, Lithuanian, and Polish, asking for their prayers. He also spoke in a half-dozen other languages, including English.
To all of you who speak English, may Christ give you his grace and his peace, overturning the barriers of division and making all things one in him.
As priests fanned out to the tens of thousands in St. Peter's to give communion, another small line of the faithful, mostly from Poland, received communion from the new pontiff. And unlike his predecessor, who wanted to reach out to the crowd but was restrained by papal assistance, John Paul II walked boldly down the sloping steps of the basilica at the end of the Mass to bless a woman in a wheelchair and a score of other pilgrims who pushed to get near him. Moments later, a bouquet was thrown from the crowd, and a young boy picked it up. Faltering between the stern wave-off of a papal aide, and the beckoning of the pontiff. It had been a precedent-breaking installation ceremony, punctuated at times by emotion and surprise, a celebration that tens of thousands simply refused to leave. And shortly after the more than 3-hour service had ended, Pope John Paul appeared again, this time at his apartment window with a special message for the young people in the square below. "You are the future of the world," he told them. "You are the hope of the church. You are my hope." The crowd responded with enthusiastic and continuous applause until the pontiff said, "We have to finish. It's time for lunch, even for a pope."
A voi e al Papa.
He inherited a church that had begun changing course more than a decade earlier. The new directions were set by an extraordinary gathering known as Vatican II.
Vatican II was the most revolutionary thing that had happened to the church in the entire history of the church, and this was a Parliament of the World's Bishops that met, called together by John the 23rd in 1962, and for 4 years, some 2,200 bishops from around the world rewrote a charter for the church, trying to make it more a church of love and less a church of laws.
Among the most visible shifts brought by Vatican II, the world's more than 1 billion Catholics could celebrate Mass in their own languages rather than Latin. They could eat meat on Fridays. But for many, the loosening of old rules went too far.
According to some, the church was infected with too much freedom. And so here comes John Paul II, and he kind of agreed with these people that the church had gone a little too far, that there was just entirely too much freedom out there, and he tried to clamp down. So in that sense, he signified a turnabout, an about-face. Church was going one direction, here comes John Paul II taking it another direction.
The new pope supported Vatican II's call for ecumenism, harmony among Christian churches and between Christians and non-Christians. But while many expected there to be more flexibility in church doctrine, Pope John Paul offered none. At the cost of alienating some churchgoers, he took a hard line against what he called the culture of death, which encompassed artificial birth control, euthanasia, the death penalty, and especially abortion. On this score, he was especially critical of the United States. He took Americans to task in a football stadium mass in 1995.
Sadly, today a new class of people is being excluded. When the unborn child, the stranger in the womb, is declared to be beyond the protection of society, not only are America's deepest traditions radically undermined and endangered, but a moral blight is brought upon society. I am also thinking of threats to the elderly, the severely handicapped, and all those who do not seem to have any social usefulness. When innocent human beings are declared inconvenient or burdensome, and thus unworthy of legal and social protection, grievous damage is done to the moral foundations of the democratic society community. The right to life is the first of all rights. It is the foundation of democratic liberties and the keystone of the edifice of civil society. Both as Americans and as followers of Christ, American Catholics must be committed to the defense of life, in all its stages and in every condition.
Unbowed by critics of the left and the right, he confounded those who tried to pigeonhole him as conservative or liberal.
He is a man who defies those categories because he can only be understood, first and foremost, as a Christian disciple. And that discipleship, that seeing everything through a theological lens, if you will, simply does not lend itself to this conventional left-right categorization.
He urged that his clergymen also see things through a theological lens rather than a political one.
I think he would see a dividing line between religion and partisan politics. Religion, morality, ethics have a tremendous place to play in politics, and he wasn't about to deny that. Where he draw the line is in partisan politics.
Viewing legislative work as too divisive, the Pope ordered priests out of government. For Father Robert Drinan of Massachusetts, it meant leaving his seat in the U.S. House of Representatives.
As a person of faith, I must believe that there is work for me to do which somehow will be more important than the work which I am required to leave. I undertake this new pilgrimage with pain and with prayers.
The Pope pursued his own brand of politics. It was potent, and it shattered the very foundations of world power. Less than a year after his installation, John Paul returned to his native Poland, the first papal trip ever to a communist country.
It was almost impossible for the communist Polish government to tell the Polish people, you can't have a visit from the Pope. They had a revolution on their hands if they couldn't see a Polish Pope in Poland.
For communism in Poland, it was the beginning of the end.
Gorbachev said to me, the one big mistake of communism was allowing Pope John Paul II to come to Poland right after he was elected Pope. Because once he came to Poland, it just united the people of Poland.
3 million Poles, twice the population of Warsaw, came out to welcome him home. The city's Victory Square was turned into an open-air cathedral for a papal mass. Among the witnesses was CBS News correspondent Tom Fenton.
It was, most of all, his sermon that the crowd was waiting for. Polish Catholics living under a communist government are used to speaking in code and understanding veiled allusions. They had no trouble understanding the Pope. The sermon was a bold challenge to a government that promotes atheism and discriminates against the Church. Christ, he told the expectant crowd, cannot be excluded from the history of the human race in any time or in any place. That was enough to set off the crowd, and waves of applause rolled across the square. The Pope listened to the deeply emotional response of the huge crowd, himself deeply moved. The crowd sang spontaneously, "We want God in our Polish books. We want God in our Polish schools."
I knew in a moment that everything had changed, that nothing would be the same again.
The visit inspired the Poles to unite against the country's communist regime. Workers created an independent labor movement called Solidarity the following year. At its helm was Lech Wałęsa, a young shipyard electrician. Solidarity staged a strike in Gdansk, site of Poland's biggest shipyard. Soon the whole nation was rocked by strikes and uprisings. Barely a year after the movement was launched, it had more than 10 million members. In December 1981, the Polish government outlawed Solidarity and imposed martial law. But John Paul II showed his support for the movement by denouncing the false peace of totalitarian regimes in his New Year's address. In St. Peter's Square, crowds cheered his rallying cry for freedom. The Pope returned to Poland next in 1983, when the country was still in the throes of martial law, occupied by its own army. At a time when the hopes of Poland's people were flagging, the Pope's visit renewed their faith in their cause.
I think the moment that most impressed me was a crowd of several 100,000 who all at the same time flashed the V sign. It was stunning, and you knew then that the Poles would never give up, that the communists would never win, and that it was just a matter of time before the whole thing collapsed.
When John Paul returned to Poland in 1987, the landscape had changed dramatically. It would take just one more push from the Pope for the regime to topple altogether. And there was no better place for this than the shipyard city of Gdansk, the birthplace of solidarity. In his previous trips to Poland, the government refused to let him go there. This time, grudgingly, it relented.
I think they thought they could control it. I think they thought, well, he hasn't been there, he wants to go there, he's pretty well got to go there, we'll just try to keep a lid on it. And so they basically seal off the town. There are roadblocks everywhere. They try to limit the numbers. But out of this field, what was the size of the crowd? 500,000, 1 million, who knows? Bigger than the population of the town. It was almost as if the futility of the Polish state was demonstrated in contrast to the power of the people being expressed at that Mass in Gdansk. The altar had been built in the form of a huge prow of a ship. The shipyard reference was everywhere. This was a pope who always understood the power of imagery, always understood the power of television.
The Pope never referred to the banned labor group directly, but in urging support for the workers, the word he used repeatedly was solidarity.
Za solidarność.
It was all but over for Poland's communist tyranny.
He had the impact of a battering ram on the old regime. He was an amazing person. It was not just the force of his personality, it was his Polishness, it was his Catholicism. He spoke to the Poles like no one else could.
A new round of strikes led Poles directly to the ballot box. In 1989, they held their first freely contested election since World War II. Solidarity won in a landslide. It was a victory for which the Pope claimed only a modest role.
As he said, communism at some point was going to implode on its own accord. He says the tree was rotten, I just gave it a good shake.
The shake he gave in Poland reverberated throughout the Iron Curtain countries. Across the Eastern Bloc, people began asking, if the Poles can rise up, why can't we? The fact is, they could, and they did. It wasn't long before the biggest tree of all fell, as the Soviet flag was lowered at the Kremlin for the last time. In 1998, the Pope tried to give a similar shake to communism's outpost in the Western Hemisphere. He made an unprecedented trip to Cuba, where, unlike the chilly reception he got from Polish officials, he was warmly greeted by Fidel Castro. Castro's atheist government allowed the Pope to hold outdoor masses, the first public masses permitted there in 40 years. Castro hoped for, and got, the Pope's denunciation of the U.S. trade embargo against Cuba, but the Pope also hammered the communist leader to improve his human rights record and loosen the reins on the country's Catholic Church.
I think he wanted to open Cuba up in the way that he opened up Poland. I think he succeeded. And what told me he succeeded was my assignment on the day of the big Mass was to be back in the crowd. And there was a man standing next to me, an older Cuban man, who spoke good English. And he would not say this on camera, but I said, "What do you think?" And he laughed and he said, I think they, meaning the Cuban government, have made the biggest mistake of their lives in letting him come here. And I said, why do you say that? He said, because the genie's out of the bottle and they can't put it back.
While he was an ardent foe of communism, Pope John Paul II found deep faults with capitalism as well.
All of humanity must think of the parable of the rich man and the beggar.
He chastised rich nations, comparing them to the wealthy man in the Bible who ignored the needs of the beggar Lazarus. The rich man was deemed contemptible not for his bankroll, but for his behavior.
Now, Herr, does Christ condemn the mere possession of earthly goods as such? Instead, he pronounces very harsh words against those who use their possessions in a selfish way, without paying attention to the needs of others.
He urged rich governments to forgive the debts of developing nations.
We cannot stand idle by, enjoying our own riches and freedom. If in any place the Lazarus of the 20th century stands at our doors,
support for the poor was a steady drumbeat of the Pope's more than 36 trips to Latin America, a region he visited more than any place but Europe. It's home to half of all Catholics. And Brazil is thought to be home to more Catholics than any other country. Brazil has long suffered from an enormous income gap between rich and poor. Each time John Paul went there, he made a point to stop in some of the country's worst slums. He blasted the government for the abhorrent treatment of its neediest people. In 1980, he left his cardinal's ring behind in a shantytown as a token of his love for the poor. His tours of Spanish-speaking countries were often politically charged. On his first Latin American trip, he stunned church leaders by denouncing the liberation theology movement. Liberation theology was a blend of Catholicism with Marxist activism. Many in Latin America saw it as a way out of poverty and powerlessness. But to Pope John Paul, it was contrary to the Church's spiritual mission, and leaders who continued to support it were replaced. The most direct confrontations between the Pope and leftist leaders came in Nicaragua in 1983. On his arrival, he admonished a priest who'd refused to leave that country's Sandinista government. But the worst friction lay ahead. The altar for his Mass was laden with revolutionary images, but one symbol was pointedly missing. There was no cross. Hecklers with the apparent support of the government chanted, "We want peace." Soon, the Pope had had enough.
Silencio.
Silence, he demanded.
La primera que quiere la paz es la Iglesia.
The first to want peace, he said, is the Church. He was treated with more respect in 1996 when he returned to Nicaragua, then under friendlier management. Throughout his papacy, the Catholic Church faced growing competition from Protestant denominations in Latin America. But warm welcomes were the norm for his visits to Spanish-speaking countries and to Spanish-speaking communities. In response, he often asked for a greater commitment to the Church. Here's what he told worshipers in San Antonio, Texas.
Me llena de gozo el saber que el número de los sacerdotes, religiosos y religiosas hispanos va en aumento, pero aún son necesarios mucho más. Jóvenes hispanos, sentís la llamada de Cristo. Familias hispanas, ¿estáis dispuestas a entregar vuestros hijos al ministerio de la Iglesia? ¿Rogáis insistentemente al dueño de la mies que envíe operarios a su mies? Cristo necesita operarios que trabajen en la abundante mies de la comunidad hispana y en toda la iglesia.
It was a moment that shocked the world. In May 1981, the Pope was shot in St. Peter's Square. While a horrified crowd looked on, he was raced from the scene. A Turkish national was immediately arrested for the crime. People around the globe prayed for the Pope's recovery. As he did throughout his life, John Paul took strength from his faith.
He was spared, and he felt that was a miracle. And he talked about it a lot. He said at the same time, you know, we're all spared.
The wound kept him in the hospital for 22 days, but with amazing speed and vigor, he picked up where he left off.
I think that when he survived that assassination attempt, he stood taller. Stood taller in his own eyes as well as the eyes of the world. And he went on and became even stronger in so many ways.
Eventually, he took a remarkable step. 2.5 years after the shooting, Pope John Paul traveled to prison to meet the gunman, pray with him, and forgive him. Ambassador Flynn later talked to the Pope about the visit.
And he says, Christ died on the cross for our sins, but we always must forgive. And we must forgive and forget, and every day is a new day in the eyes of Christ.
The year after the assassination attempt, John Paul resumed the most grueling travel schedule any pope has known. Altogether, he made more than 90 foreign trips to more than 120 countries. On arrival, a familiar gesture, kneeling on the ground and kissing it. In his later years, when that became too difficult, the ground was brought to him. The simple message, respect for the country and its people. His connection to those people was breathtaking to witness.
If you talk to people who were in these huge audiences, it was always amazing to hear the same answer from many people around the world, where in a crowd of hundreds of thousands of people, they would say, I felt that he was speaking just to me. I felt that I was the only person there.
He just exudes this sense of being a holy man, a man in touch with the divine, not in an exclusive, arrogant sense, because his basic message is, hey, guess what? You can be too. Come aboard. You be in touch with the divine too. You can be holy.
At his public appearances, there was electricity in the air.
You feel it, you hear the sound, and you feel something moving in the air as the crowd, there's a swelling as he approaches, and it's like a wave coming before him. And when he eventually arrives in, say, a football stadium, it's like the team running onto the field. It erupts, but in a very nice way.
He didn't even have to show up in person to touch a crowd. From the very start, he grasped the power of television.
It happened the first day that he hit St. Peter's Square as the Pope. He came out on that balcony. He looked around and he could see 7 television cameras trained on him. And I'm sure that the light bulb went on over his head. Wow, what a bully pulpit I have. And this is the new thing, television. I can be here and I can be everywhere in the world at the same time.
He lived in an era when communications media exploded. He knew how to take advantage of that, how to use it for his own purposes, the purposes of the church.
From time to time, that even meant letting television cameras behind the scenes in Rome. CBS News correspondent Charles Kuralt took viewers inside the Vatican in 1988.
On the 3rd floor of the papal apartments facing St. Peter's Square, the private office of Pope John Paul II is vacant at this hour. And the most famous window in the world, the one in which he appears to bless the multitudes, looks down at this hour on no multitudes. Most of Rome is still asleep. The Pope is awake and alone. He is in the small chapel across the hall from his bedroom, in what appears to be an intense private dialogue with God. It's about the last private moment he will have all day. At 7 a.m. precisely, a handful of guests arrives for a small morning mass with the successor of St. Peter. The guests come every morning. Today they are visitors from France. This is the experience of a lifetime for most of them. Here in this little room at dawn, the spiritual leader of 850 million Roman Catholics gains energy for another day. For 10 years now, John Paul has been packing them in, wowing his fans. He is a superstar.
Vergebung wegen ihrer Unwissenheit.
Whatever your language,
Hermanos y hermanas.
he'll make an effort to speak it.
Je te le déclare.
To speak it to you.
All that Jesus did and told.
He is the most public pope. Anybody who wants to can come here and see him any Wednesday, unless, of course, he's out there in the world somewhere visiting them. Beyond a doubt, more ordinary people have seen John Paul with their own eyes than have seen all the previous popes of history. His manner is gentle, but his message is tough. Faith, obedience, devotion. He plays to the crowd, but he preaches discipline.
He knows what he's doing. He's an old actor. He needs eye contact with the public as a stage actor. He's not a cinema actor or a TV actor, he's stage. He can catch the eyes of people, no matter how many are there. They all think he's looking at them. Each one thinks he's looking at him.
Wilton Wynn has reported on the Vatican for more than 30 years. It seems to me that he has very little privacy. I mean, he's always with people, isn't he?
His breakfast is a working breakfast, his lunch is working, his dinner is a working dinner. And in between, he's meeting people all the time.
God bless you.
I think the Pope is regarded in most places now as a very tough conservative, even rigid man.
Well, to him, running the Catholic Church is not a popularity contest. He's got to stick to what is right, what he believes is right and true, even if it means losing every Catholic in the world.
He is, when it comes to charisma, an irresistible force. And when it comes to doctrine, an immovable object. Well, here comes the Pope.
From Rochester, New York.
You wait in this line, a little nervously, knowing that the Pope hardly ever gives interviews.
It's Camden, New Jersey.
But you think, I'll charm him, and we'll chat for a while. In fact, you rehearse questions in your mind. What about Vatican relations with the Third World, Your Holiness? Things like that. You notice he's giving everyone a little brown package. It's a rosary. Well, here he is. You find yourself grinning foolishly, and this is what happens. SBC. We are doing a documentary, Father, on the Vatican, trying to understand the Vatican.
Oh, Vatican. Peace. Thank you. You are English.
American. Yes, and we are doing 48 hours in the Vatican, very intensely. Yes.
40 hours.
Yes.
40 hours. Thank you. God bless your activity.
Well, that's all. He's gone. You didn't charm him. He charmed you.
Pope John Paul charmed millions of Americans, but his relationship with the United States was anything but simple. During his U.S. visits, he often came face to face with dissent, sometimes from non-Catholics, sometimes from inside the church itself. On his first American tour, a nun made a startling public plea for the ordination of women.
I urge you, Your Holiness, to be open to and to respond to the voices coming from the women of this country who are desirous of serving in and through the church as fully participating members.
And he then said to her, because he'd been warned that Mary Teresa Kane was going to come out with this statement, he lectured her and reminded her that the Blessed Virgin Mary was not a member of the hierarchy.
In 1987 in San Francisco, gay rights advocates and AIDS activists met the Pope with demonstrations.
Gay rights now!
They criticized the church's stand against homosexual behavior and warned that the church might be less than compassionate towards people with AIDS. At the time, many people feared that they could put their lives at risk by even touching someone with AIDS. With one gesture, Pope John Paul II addressed both fears.
There was this little boy who was in the church. He had caught AIDS through a transfusion. The Pope embraced him. It was a sign also to some of the critics. It doesn't matter how you got this disease, we still want to be compassionate with you. It was difficult for a lot of people to sort of accept that compassion. He did it through this little boy.
It was just one way he touched lives in the U.S., a country he visited again and again, as correspondent Bob McNamara remembers.
He was just a man, but like magic. Everywhere Pope John Paul II traveled in this country, in the streets, in the stadiums, crowds were in the hundreds of thousands. In 5 American visits over 2 decades, Pope John Paul saw 20 cities and 4 presidents. Most people would catch just a fleeting glimpse of the man, but many would be forever touched.
I never get this close to the Pope.
He's a tremendous personality, and he has that magnetism that you just don't find anywhere else.
But for all of the clamor, all of the massive crowds, some of the most lasting memories of John Paul II were made in the smallest of places. Tiny St. Patrick's Catholic Church, deep in the heart of Iowa.
He came in the church and, he kind of gave me a hug and asked me if I was Irish.
What'd you tell him?
I told him I didn't know.
Bob Mulvihill Jr. was 9, an altar boy, the day Pope John Paul came to St. Patrick's in 1979 for a prayer service. As the Pope walked down the aisle, Jennifer Mulvihill touched his hand.
It's a keychain and it's pure gold.
It is. And a gift from the Pope.
It has a Pope on it.
She still treasures.
Exciting?
Mm-hmm. It was nice to meet him.
He was so normal, for being so important that it made me proud now to be Catholic and to be part of the church and part of the Irish settlement, and that's something that'll never be taken away from me, is that memory and the pride of being there.
He spent only an hour at this little country church, but the Pope seemed almost reluctant to leave.
I don't think I've ever been so excited, or it's just been a wonderful time.
It was a validating moment because he came here and he said, you're a rural community, you are stewards of the land, you do what you do because you love what you do.
Very nice.
And you're doing a good job.
But the small family farm that was the Mulvihills' life then would be lost, like thousands of others, to the farm financial crisis of the 1980s. And yet the faith they practiced the day the Pope visited is the same.
I don't know that we've lived our lives any different because of it, but I think we certainly appreciate how special it was.
From his first visit to this country to the fragile figure he was on his last trip here, all the pageantry and choreography of each papal event could never camouflage the fact that the Roman Catholic Church's holiest man was most of all a humble man.
The children whose lives he touched in Iowa back in 1979 demonstrate the special connection he always had with young people. Just the day before, he wowed them in Manhattan. Covering the story for the New York Times was reporter Robert Blair Kaiser.
I was lucky enough to get sent to Madison Square Garden, where 20,000 raving teenagers were there waiting for the Pope to come in. He came in a Jeep, open car. He looked like a heavyweight champion boxer. He looked like Rocky. He went around to the front of the auditorium, and I thought, wow, this guy has a presence. I already knew he had been an actor, an amateur actor in his youth in Poland. Well, he was playing up to the role right now. He was the Pope.
The kids loved him. The feeling was mutual.
He started going, woo, woo, woo. Woo, 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 woo. And I found out later, in Polish, that means wow, wow, wow.
Today, this is a garden of life, where young people are alive.
I think that was the first moment that he realized that maybe the kids were a great place for him to carry the Christian message.
Alive with hope and love. Alive with the life of Christ.
That realization inspired a new way to connect to young Catholics. World Youth Days, held periodically around the world. This one was in Denver, 1993.
God bless the young people of the World Youth Day.
Organizers expected around 50,000. They got nearly 400,000.
It's almost like John Paul II, the superstar, only he's not a rock star. He's a man, a religious leader who tells them the truth. I think that's his chemistry with young people.
As age and ailments weakened him physically, the Pope's personal strength became all the more impressive.
I remember being in Sarajevo. He came out of a car and he looked very frail. The crowd was very close to him and he just simply burst away. He just went straight to the crowd and reached out to them. And as he went to them, you could see him physically straighten, but also psychologically. He was pumped. He pulled their energy into himself and came back to them, and it was an interaction of energy, and he was hitting his stride again. And I think that's what struck me always, is that as soon as he got to the people, anywhere near people, he was a changed man.
One of the most enduring legacies of his papacy will be his efforts to bring people together.
He always felt that priests, that religion, that the church, especially the papacy, must unite people. It must be a bridge.
Much of his effort and some of his best-known trips were aimed at turning that principle into practice. He prayed with the Archbishop of Canterbury, helping bridge a gulf that first opened when Henry VIII was King of England. He became the first pope to visit Greece in nearly 13 centuries. While there, he issued an apology for Catholic transgressions against the Orthodox Church. In Syria, he became the first pope to enter a mosque. But of all such trips, one of the most remarkable was one of the shortest. Mark Phillips covered the story for CBS News.
For Pope John Paul, who has traveled so far and so frequently, this trip of about 1 mile from the Vatican to Rome's main synagogue rivals any other for significance. Today's visit was described as one the Pope wanted to make to give impetus to the 20-year-old document from Vatican II, absolving Jews from any responsibility for the killing of Christ. That's a hope the Italian Jewish community has as well.
Christians who will see a pope entering a synagogue and reciting a psalm in a synagogue will probably find it more difficult to believe that the Jews are an accursed people.
Today the Pope did enter a synagogue and did recite a psalm, and he did more. In his speech, he quoted from the Vatican II document, saying he deplored the hatred, persecutions, and displays of anti-Semitism directed against the Jews at any time by anyone. He repeated, by anyone.
Ripeto, da chiunque.
Not only was this the first time a pope has visited a synagogue, but this particular temple is built on the site of the old Roman Jewish ghetto, a ghetto established by the papacy in the 16th century. Rome's chief rabbi, Elio Toaf, presides over a community that has lived at the whim of the various popes for centuries, and that whim has not always been kindly. Rabbi Toaf called the visit a gesture destined to pass into history, a turning point in church policy. Monumental though this visit is in terms of Catholic-Jewish relations, no one is expecting 2,000 years of history to be overturned in one afternoon. But this is a pope given to grand gestures, and in the view of the Roman Jewish community, this is a gesture that wouldn't hurt. Pope John Paul did not deal today with the question of the Vatican's lack of official recognition of the State of Israel. Still, this was an afternoon when the Bishop of Rome shared a synagogue podium with the chief rabbi of the oldest Jewish community in Europe. It was an afternoon of redressing the sins of the past and of holding out hope for the future. And for most people here, that was enough.
4 years later, another unprecedented effort to heal wounds.
I think it's one of the most revolutionary things that he did. On March the 12th, the year 2000, he issued his famous mea culpa.
It was a sumptuous ceremony to ask forgiveness for the sins of the Church itself. Pope John Paul II called it the Day of Pardon. We forgive, he said, and ask forgiveness. It was the first time in the 2,000 years of church history that a leader has publicly sought sweeping forgiveness for acts committed in the name of the faith. Dressed in the purple robes of Lent, cardinals read out the acts of contrition. They mentioned violence in the service of truth, referring to the treatment of heretics during the Crusades, the Inquisition, and the forced conversion of native peoples. The confessions, Pope John Paul said, did not entail judgments. That, he added, was up to God alone. It was an extraordinary action, but it was also a prelude to a historic trip just days later to the Holy Land.
I think the thing that struck me more than anything was at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. He went to the Holocaust Memorial and he walked across the floor, that granite floor in which are carved all the names of all the death camps. And he went across that to turn up the flame, which is the symbolic gesture that you make when you are an important person visiting Yad Vashem. As he moved across there, you could feel the weight of that place and the terrible, terrible thing that it represents. And he was carrying it all. And it wasn't because he was a frail man. And then the next day, of course, he went to the Wailing Wall and he placed a prayer in the wall. That gesture and that slow walk across that black granite floor, I think, did more to bring Christians and Jews together, not just Catholics, but Christians and Jews together than any other single thing.
Perhaps the great temptation of the 20th century was the fact that we had forgotten God. That means that the 20th century was the century of greatest bloodshed, the century of greatest tyranny, the century of greatest oppression ever known to humanity. And he said, why? Precisely because we've forgotten the ethical, the moral, the religious dimension of humanity. We need to restore that, and I need all the help I can get in restoring that. I need help from the Jewish community. I need help from the Islamic community. I need help from the non-Catholic Christian community. And it's about time we came together and said, we're not, the different religions aren't enemies. What's enemies is what we have a mutual enemy in the lack of religion.
In all, Pope John Paul II was true to the ancient Latin name for the pontiff, Pontifex Maximus, the great builder of bridges. This was a pope who spanned 2 millennia.
His principal religious message came to a culmination with the Jubilee year. The year 2000 was not just a simple turning of the clock. The year 2000 represented the 2000th anniversary of the birth of Jesus Christ. God become man. And that's what his program is. He's the vicar of Christ on earth, and all these priests and all these nuns and all these billion Catholics around the world are other Christs.
This was a pope who found one church and left behind one that was profoundly changed.
I think perhaps the most important thing he has been for those of us who have been privileged to be alive during this pontificate is a great witness, a great inspiration, an extraordinary human story, which I think probed seriously enough opens up the question of God, the question of religious conviction in a very powerful way for people who haven't asked it for a long time.
I think he's one of the greatest popes of all time. He has really gone around the world encouraging not only the prime leaders, the prime ministers and the presidents and the kings and the elite in every nation to live up to their duties, to be top leaders and to make a more peaceful world. He's encouraged the people at large to do the same thing.
This was a pope who was born into one world and worked ceaselessly to leave behind a better one.